We are experiencing technical difficulties. Please stand by. The story you are about to hear, like many stories that harbor the conceit of embedding a lesson within their narrative, begins with the time and location evading phrase, "Once upon a time." For indeed, once upon a time, there lived a bard of great renown, clever in word and accomplished in song. As a young man, he journeyed about much of the known world, serenading kings and regaling the common folk with tales of wisdom and wonder. As time passed, the bard continued to hone his craft. His fame grew, his skills were highly praised, and he found himself in much demand among humble villages and grand courts alike, where word of his exceptional talents was invariably recounted with reverent awe. But although he appeared to have been gifted by the gods themselves, alas, the bard himself was naught but a mortal man, and, like all men, the vigor of youth unerringly gave way to the deficiencies of age, such that he could no longer travel far and wide as before. Thus it was he retreated into the forest and built a wondrous grotto of topaz, amethyst, and hematite. Within the innermost sanctum of the grotto, he placed a throne-like chair of marble for himself, and he invited all who would wish to know what he knew to speak as he had spoken, and to play as he had played, to come and sit at the foot of his chair, that they might learn from him the ways of the bard, and of the tales he had told, and the songs he had sung. It is generally accepted by contemporary scholars that the roots of tarot can be traced back to Renaissance Italy in the early portion of the 15th century. It is not surprising, then, that what we observe in the earliest decks reflects a pantheon of European nobles and clergy and a highly apostolic array of virtues and vices. And among the major arcana, there is perhaps no greater evidence of tarot's Christian underpinnings than that of the Hierophant card. In most ways, the card changed little in its essential format over the course of the next 400 years, although its designation as the Hierophant, rather than the Pope, is attributed to Antoine Comte de Gévillon, who declared it thus during his formulation of the now debunked Egyptian origin theory of tarot in the late 1700s. As tarot evolved over the next 100 years, a lack of accessible documentation and reliable research left a void in tarot's history, which the 19th century occultists were keen to fill with various theories of the cards as a repository of arcane wisdom. By the middle of the 20th century, tarot's original use as a card game was all but forgotten outside of certain pockets within Europe, replaced instead with a dichotomy of beliefs: those who rejected the cards as a frightening and profane device, and those who embraced them as a tool of psychological and spiritual enhancement. Both views, however, suffered from a misunderstanding of tarot, a confusion which had arguably resulted from the replacement of tarot's true history with fabricated accounts constructed by the occult scholars of the 19th and early 20th centuries, coupled with the adoption of tarot as a demonic MacGuffin in popular media. By the 1960s, the perspective of the spiritually fluid counterculture seems to have been molded by the former, while the mindset of the general public appears to have been influenced by the latter. Each of these viewpoints, however, left the Hierophant in an unenviable position, as both perspectives repudiated the card in their own ways. Those that rejected tarot outright as being a satanic apparatus would, of course, evaluate the Hierophant unfavorably by definition. Yet those open to utilizing tarot for personal advancement were occasionally equally uncharitable, having a tendency to analyze the Hierophant through the lens of Victorian patriarchy and/or Christian dogmatism.
The Hierophant means repressive conformity, captivity, servitude, empty ritual. A concern for form over function, a desire to hold on to old things even if they are outdated. A desire to control others, or a position in which you have allowed yourself to be controlled by others.
The Hierophant has often been related to the formal, i.e. restrictive practices and authority of organized religion, laws that are often more arbitrary and culturally determined than they are representative of universal truths. He is one who demands attention and respect, and who makes pronouncements with the absolute assurance that they are correct.
Perhaps we reject the idea of a guiding priesthood for a more subtle reason. Ever since the Reformation, a notion that has gained greater and greater force in the West is that of the individual's ultimate responsibility for him or herself. The whole idea of an outer doctrine, a code of rules and beliefs accepted on faith, depends on the assumption that most people prefer to have someone else tell them what to do and think. But many people today simply cannot accept either society or a church bearing the ultimate responsibility for their lives.
While individual cards within tarot may tend to be characterized in a general sense as positive or negative, it is worth considering that the Hierophant, when standing alone, as with any of the other 77 cards, is intrinsically neutral in tone and message. One or two aspects of its infinite spectrum of possibilities are revealed by its context within a reading, but only for that fleeting moment. Outside of a reading, the card's meaning reverts to its undifferentiated state, like an uncollapsed quantum wave, collapsing again only when it intersects with our own expectations and biases. From many lands they came, supplicants who sought the opportunity to sit beside the marble chair and learn from the great master. Some came in earnest as open vessels, anxious to be filled with songs and stories that they would preserve and pass on to those who would follow. Others presented themselves with more selfish intent, hoping to learn the secret of the bard's great skill so that they might aspire to fame and wealth through the praise of others. But the bard gave no crumb to their reasons for submitting themselves to his instruction, for he had become wise in his old age, and well understood it was not his place to chart another's path. So he welcomed all who undertook the pilgrimage to his grotto, and patiently shared what he knew with those who would listen. And when he had taught them all that he could, he urged them to go forth into the world to seek their fortune, share their knowledge, and write the tales and ballads that would become the foundations of their own legacies. One by one, seekers came and left the grotto. Some traveled to exotic lands and went on grand adventures. Some returned from whence they came and lived ordinary lives. Some dedicated themselves to noble causes. Some garnered great acclaim. Some were never heard from again. Like seeds scattered upon the wind, the bard's disciples dispersed, propagating his prose and canticles far and wide. A few even became great bards in their own right, but it seemed none would ever rival the transcendent artistry of their master, who in times gone by had afforded tender respite to the suffering and brought tears to the eyes of warrior kings. Let us briefly return to the historical roots of the Hierophant. While contemporary ideology tends to view the arenas of science and theology as separated at best and antithetical at worst, this was largely not the case with the humanist movement of the Renaissance. Many proponents of humanist studies were themselves either clergy or adjuncts to the Catholic Church. German philosopher and Renaissance scholar Ernst Cassirer asserts that most humanists of the period were religious. Their goal was to purify and renew Christianity, not to dismantle it. Thus, we see the Church not only as the disseminator of theological information, but of classical knowledge as well. Some of the first humanists were collectors of antique manuscripts, and many worked for the Catholic Church and belonged to holy orders, including the Aretine poet and scholar Petrarch, who is credited with the rediscovery of the letters of the Roman statesman Cicero. Within this context, it isn't necessarily a stretch to see beyond the Hierophant's role as the arbiter of spiritual doctrine, and instead assign him to the broader role of teacher. In this expanded capacity, he is positioned to impart general instruction of many types. For the people of 15th century Italy, this would have included such things as classical languages and texts, specifically Latin and Greek, history, mathematics, and astronomy. While dogmatic adherence to theological principles was certainly not absent from Renaissance life, it was perhaps not as restrictive as we, 500 years on, tend to imagine it. In light of this augmented understanding of the Church's practices during the creation of the first tarots, we can see how some late 20th and current 21st century deck creators began to reimagine the Hierophant to reflect his function as a conduit of diverse arenas of knowledge. Indeed, the overarching parable that frames this presentation was inspired in part by the Hierophant equivalent card from Caitlin and John Matthews' Arthurian Tarot. In the Matthews deck, the Hierophant is represented by Taliesin, a 6th century bard sometimes connected to Arthurian mythos. Purported to have sung at the courts of at least 3 Brittonic kings, his work, or at least some portions of it, are believed to have survived in a Middle Welsh manuscript dubbed the Book of Taliesin. In the Arthurian Tarot, we see Taliesin seated in much the same fashion as in traditional Hierophant cards. His chair is surrounded by a tableau of animals that relate to the myth of how he was transformed from the humble servant known as Guillaume Bach to become the all-knowing bard of legend. More importantly, however, we see that the acolytes present in the Marseillaise pattern have been replaced here by two children. And instead of a hand raised up in blessing, Taliesin's arms rest on the arms of his seat, his palms open and turned upward. Two golden cords pass through his hands from behind the chair and into the hands of the children at his feet. The cord continues on through the children's hands, disappearing beneath the bottom of the frame of the illustration. According to the Matthews, the cords represent the knowledge of past ages, their sources long forgotten. Thus, we cannot see behind the chair to know from whence the cords originate. Now, as the cords pass through his hands, Taliesin has become the conduit through which the information is passed along. The children are receiving the knowledge from the bard, but as we cannot see where these cords end, we understand that the children will ultimately bear the burden of conveying the knowledge to the generation to follow. After many a year had passed, and the bard was nearing the end of his life, a black-robed visitor arrived at the grotto, bearing a fiddle of ebony wood. The visitor, although not a young woman, was not as aged as was the bard, and she carried herself with a comportment imbued with strength and integrity. The visitor entered the inner sanctum of the grotto and placed herself submissively at the foot of the marble chair. She spoke not a word, but waited respectfully until the bard addressed her. "Welcome, friend. Why have you come?" The visitor replied, "Many years ago I sat here, as I do now, awed by your great skill and prodigious knowledge. In my youth, you instructed me with patience and kindness, lifting me up with your guidance so that I might achieve my higher purpose. In the years since I left the grotto, I have traveled across the many realms of men, enthralling the powerful with my songs and bringing stories of hope to the burdened. But I have become too old for such adventures now. I seek naught but the halcyon life of a cloistered ascetic, and shall leave here to become one. But first, I wish to bring my journey full circle, ending where I began. I departed from this sacred space bearing the blessing of your instruction. I return to it now to declare my gratitude for all you have given me. Your generosity has helped me to experience the full wondrousness of the world, to see it with clarity and purity. But most importantly, it has allowed me to share beauty with others, replacing the cold darkness of ignorance with the warm light of knowing, if even just for the briefest of moments. For all this and more, I thank you." The bard was deeply touched by the visitor's words, for none before her had returned to the grotto once they had left. Smiling, the bard said, "Before you go, please, share with me some tales of your travels. I have lived here a very long time now, and would hear one last song of the world before I depart from it, if you would favor me so." The visitor nodded her head in reverent respect and rose. Placing her fiddle beneath her chin, she gently drew its bow across the glistening strings and began to play a wordless song that spoke of many things, of ascendancy and strife, of love and sorrow, of peace and defeat, of progress and worry. Beauty and heartache saturated the essence of every note. Awestruck, the bard sat unmoving, enveloped so deeply in the powerful rhapsody that his surroundings seemed to disappear, replaced by an outpouring of reverberating energy that was at once both everywhere and nowhere. And when the visitor's bow at last slipped softly from its ebony carriage, its final note echoing longingly as it strained against its extinguishment into the inevitable silence, the bard placed his hands to his face and wept. In addition to portraying notable figures of the Italian social order, early tarot trumps depicted intellectual and ethical concepts integral to that society. Among these is the cardinal virtue of temperance. The original image, carried forward in varying renditions well into the 20th century, is of a woman bearing two vessels. In most renditions, she is pouring liquid from one vessel into the other. The assumption is made by most that the second vessel holds liquid as well, meaning it will ultimately contain an amalgamation of the two. This representation of temperance is ubiquitous in the art and sculpture of the card's inception period. Furthermore, it was generally implied that the pouring vessel contains water, while the receiving vessel contains wine, resulting in a dilution or tempering of the alcohol in the second cup. Whether the symbolism pertaining to the specific liquids in play was knowingly carried forward into the post-Renaissance decks may be a matter for debate, but the overall iconography of the blending of essences remained. It is the act of adding water to wine, however, that conveys the card's most logical, intuitive interpretation. All things in moderation. We grasp that the pleasant qualities of the resulting mixture can be enjoyed without overindulging, so that we may avoid succumbing to the vice of drunkenness. As we move forward into the 19th century, however, the grafting of multiple complex correspondence systems onto the cards brought new constellations of meaning into tarot's lexicon, albeit arguably not always for the better. In exploring deeper levels of meaning, we find writers from Levy to Gray expounding upon temperance's vibrational, augmentational, or purifying qualities. While not necessarily inappropriate within the context of each author's own arena of tarot studies, typically those intended to explore higher metaphysical principles, they are often much less useful to the student who simply aspires to self-actualize within their current plane of existence.
Temperance shows us the fluid, hitherto carefully preserved, now freely circulated in nature.
As we learn to transfer the life force from the imagination, moon, into the activity of the conscious, sun, the will is developed and the imagination purified so that in pouring from the silver cup to the golden one, we lose nothing.
Temperance symbolizes the seasons of the year, changes in life, the ages of man, the water of life transferred from lower to higher. It represents the changing of night into day, of darkness to light. The action of pouring implies effort, constancy, and patience in raising the passions and negative matter to positive, creative energy and its tools.
Temperance, like all tarot cards, offers us not just one, but a continuum of meanings. However, if we are seeking temperance's core meaning, the general model that will subsequently help us unlock a useful chain of associations to apply in our readings and in our daily lives, it isn't necessary to appeal to high-concept metaphysical constructs. Fortunately, it appears that many contemporary writers have begun to recenter their interpretation of temperance around its more basic historical significance, using it as a foundation for relaunching the discussion in new and more productive directions. When his tears had ceased, the bard lifted himself from the marble chair and humbly kneeled before the visitor. "Were that I were a young man again," he said, "I would beg you to teach me all that you know." Hearing this, the visitor set aside her fiddle and tenderly knelt beside her mentor. "Alas, even if it were so, I could not, for all of what I know is not more than what you have taught me, save for one thing only. And that one thing I can teach no one, for it is a type of understanding that transcends explanation. It is born at the intersection of intuition and experience, and joins you on your path only when you invite its company." The visitor stood and took the bard by the arm, lifting him gently to his feet and returning him to the marble chair. Unsatisfied by the visitor's answer, however, the bard sought further explanation. "Do your songs use naught but the notes I taught you?" "They do," replied the visitor. "And was it I who taught you how to play tones as sweet as a nightingale's song and as fearsome as the clash of swords engaged in terrible battle?" "It was." "And did you not learn from me how to play quickly when performing a coxcomb's merry jig, and slowly when offering a king's solemn requiem?" "I did, with profound gratitude, master." "And yet your performance has transcended that which I have taught you." Once again the visitor bowed her head. "I am deeply honored by your praise, but if I am worthy of it, it is only because I have cultivated a discernment of how the facets of your instruction blend together. It is this understanding that cannot truly be taught, but must be forged anew in each and every heart." Lifting her gaze once again, the visitor continued. "Such understanding does not begin and end with knowing whether to play fast and sweet or slow and strident. By and by, as I honed my craft, I began to intuit how my notes would ring within narrow walls of wood or wide halls of stone, to know if a listener would be moved more by a ballad or by a shanty, to adjust a rhythm such that it could induce melancholy or elicit excitement. And, over time, I learned how to bring these things and more into perfect balance, so that the resulting work would become a flawless, unifying agent, a reflection of the elemental truth of that particular, ephemeral moment." For several minutes the bard sat silently, contemplating the visitor's words. He reflected upon the days when he, too, had compelled assemblages to erupt into thunderous applause or to lapse into poignant, breathless silence. These experiences were not the result of the mere mastery of words and notes. They arose from a place from beyond the knowing, a place of instinct become manifest. As he concluded his analysis, the bard conceded that this was a thing that could not be taught, but it might be possible to nurture an awareness of it. And now, let us back up once again and return to the concept of temperance as the embodiment of the expression, "all things in moderation." Often, the word moderation lends itself to the implication of binary alternatives framed Goldilocks style. Not too hot, not too cold, not too hard, not too soft, but just right. This view of temperance unquestionably has its uses, but at the same time, it arguably lacks nuance. Depending on the circumstances under evaluation, it may not be enough to simply ask where the objective falls along a linear spectrum. Rather, we may be engaged in a situation that requires us to take multiple factors into account if we wish to realize the most successful outcome. In such cases, altering the weight given to one factor, or introducing a new factor, forces adjustments to all other factors, thus moving the tempering process beyond the realm of mere self-control and into the province of artistry. This is the equilibrium we seek when we strive to attain mastery in an endeavor, playing a musical instrument, excelling at a sport, finding the pinnacle of piquancy in a culinary pursuit. It is the shrewdness of business acumen and the arbitrational heart of diplomacy. It is the triumphant fusion of physical and spiritual components that results from not simply knowing, but truly understanding. In a phrase, it is holistic balance. To be clear, this is not balance as Justice applies the concept, in which we attempt to find the metaphorical fulcrum point that will allow us to best reconcile a moral or practical dilemma. It is instead a series of intersecting domains, more akin to a Venn diagram, where we are seeking the optimal point of overlap in order to maximize results. While justice exercises its restrictive energies through intellect as calibrated by the heart, temperance expresses its creative energies through the heart as calibrated by the intellect. Explored from within this schema, we can see why, in his Thoth deck, Crowley chose to rename this card as Art. The illustration of the two-headed angel, with its alternating black and white, silver and gold elements, depicts an alchemical process that is less concerned with the restraints of moderation and more interested in the synthesis of perfection. Within tarot, no card embodies the phrase, "It's more of an art than a science," more aptly than temperance. As we move forward with an exploration of temperance's pictorial evolution, then, it isn't surprising to observe how some modern decks have begun to leave the card's original Renaissance imagery behind. Such decks often favor portraits that more fully capture this expanded understanding of the balance concept, substituting any manner of props for temperance's classic pair of vessels. In our parable of the bard Hierophant, the character of the visitor was inspired by the temperance card from the Tarot of Pili, a photographic, majors-only deck comprised of a posed selection of beautiful figurines created by the Taiwanese puppetry theater Pili International. In the Pili deck, temperance is represented not by an angel alchemically blending essences, but by a master violinist plying his craft. The manuscript in the background shows a relatively simple series of notes, but the performer knows exactly how to play each one in order to elicit the full and complex beauty of the music. Eyes closed, head bowed, he is allowing his intuition to bring the myriad aspects of his artistic proficiencies together, weaving them into a singular, flawless performance. Skills are important, yes, but ultimately useless without an overarching understanding of how to combine each individual technique with the others at the right time, in the right amount. In the end, it may be the Hierophant who cultivates the foundation of mastery, but when well aspected, who also knows when it is time to allow his student to continue along their path alone. He promotes the awareness of temperance, but cannot truly take on the responsibility of fully instilling it. Yet after the exercise of temperance has made the student a master in their own right, there remains one final lesson that the Hierophant can share. Consider the following meditation on temperance from Diane Morgan's 2003 book, Magical Tarot, Mystical Tao.
Better to carry a chalice half filled than to let it run over. If you oversharpen a blade, you will soon blunt the edge. If your home is overloaded with gold and jade, you cannot protect it. Riches, honors, and arrogance carry the seeds of their own destruction. Enough is enough. When the work is done, retire.
The visitor set aside her fiddle and waited patiently at the foot of the marble chair while her master meditated. When his period of reflection had ended, she watched with curious eyes as he slowly rose to his feet, unsteady with age, yet with an unmistakable air of resolve. Gazing at her with an expression that was as gentle as it was compelling, the bard commanded, "My instrument, hand it to me." The visitor stood up and reached behind the chair. There she found the bard's lute resting forbearingly in its customary place, and withdrew it. As she did, the bard retrieved the visitor's fiddle from its makeshift resting place against the side of his chair. Relinquishing the lute to her master, the visitor accepted the bard's coincident return of her fiddle, then watched as he stepped back from his erstwhile throne and spoke unto her these words. "Much time has passed since I left my travels behind me, and built this hallowed space to preserve what I had created. The day I first sat upon this stone chair, I believed my journey had reached its end. But I tell you now, this was not so. For though I wandered the world no more, I see that I but continued along another path, a path that has been equally enlightening and simultaneously rewarding. Now you stand before me as a reflection of the journey that is past, and correspondingly as the avatar of its evolution. You believe your journey has also reached its end, but heed my words when I declare to you that you have only reached the end of the beginning. Does your appearance before me bring your journey to its inevitable closure? In truth, your return represents not a circle, but upward movement along a coil. If you look down, it becomes clear that you have not arrived at your exact starting point, but instead at a place along an axis directly above it. And in between your point of departure and your point of return, your skills have grown and become equal to mine. But you have surpassed me in sophistication. Unheedingly but undeniably, I, too, have continued my progress along the coil. This is why I must now surrender my charge here to another, and retire to discover what comes next. This is now your place. This is now your time. I pass the Master's torch to you. You have earned it. May your years here be as rewarding as they have been for me. And now, with humble deference, I shall take my leave, at ease in the knowledge that you, and those who will follow you, will not only preserve my creation, but augment it. And, having concluded his proclamation, the bard motioned for the visitor to take her place upon the marble chair. Hesitantly, the visitor lowered herself onto that sacrosanct seat, uncertain at first that she was worthy to bear its legacy. Her fiddle astride her lap, she looked up at her master's radiant brow, now seeming old in wisdom yet young in spirit, and felt comforted. Then, with his lute in hand and a final nod, the bard exited the sanctum and left the grotto, and faded into the outstretched and welcoming branches of the forest trees. The visitor, now the mistress of the inner sanctum, executed her commission with the same patience and kindness as her master before. Many came and sat at her feet to receive her teachings, and went out into the world once again as seeds scattered to the wind. None ever reported having seen the old bard after he had left the grotto, but now and again the mistress could hear his otherworldly melodies echoing from an unknown beyond, present in the wind that blew through the leaves, and ringing within the song of the wood thrush, a ballad of longing and contentment, enacted in perfect balance.